Up next on the GRIOT, Power in Narratives.
Then having to deal with these feelings we have of weariness or hopelessness or anxiety about what's going to happen next.
Dr. Tonya Armstrong of the Armstrong Center for Hope in Durham, North Carolina. This psychologist is a wife and a mother, and most definitely an American. Welcome, Dr. Tonya Armstrong. I got to tell you, I am so excited about this episode of the GRIOT. GRIOT is from West African culture, and it was a term used for people who use history and storytelling and genealogy to share their artistry. And you are indeed an artist. So one of the things that I want to make sure people understand, so in the entertainment industry, you would be considered a triple threat. And in addition to singing, you are also a published author, a great book. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the program.
Thank you.
And you started a Center for Hope as someone who is skilled and trained and specializes in helping people heal their mental health and maintain a healthy life mentally and emotionally. So thank you so much for being a GRIOT. Every single day, we're bombarded with a new headline, a new aha moment. What do you say to people navigating all of this? Because for some of us, if we're honest, we're struggling a little bit.
Michelle Obama perhaps said it best in terms of representing the national feel when she talked about the low-grade depression that she's been dealing with. I think that there is this feeling of weariness that I also wrote about in one of our recent practice newsletters, just that it feels very weary to continue to endure the challenges of COVID. And those challenges can range everything from overexposure to too many Zoom meetings and device fatigue, to having to deal with family and navigate family dynamics in a different way, having to wear the hat of at least secondary teacher if you have children in the home, if not primary, and then having to deal with these feelings we have of weariness or hopelessness or anxiety about what's going to happen next.
There's no shame in acknowledging that maybe you might need a little help.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think COVID-19 actually does give opportunities for people to recognize the need for help because the stressors have greatly increased. And we haven't even talked about the other pandemic that's going on in terms of the social injustice that we're seeing more and more clearly every day. So you've got all of these stressors, everyone is under intense pressure. And so it makes sense to be able to think about getting some professional help, but it also in many ways is more accessible because of the use of telehealth.
We just still have an aversion sometimes to the thought of sharing our pain so that we can process and be healthy. Absolutely. And my family will tell you, Tamara is a big advocate for therapy. I go, have you been to therapy? That's when I ever spent. I swear I could do a commercial.
Absolutely. We need more ambassadors.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Some people just kind of think that their healing is just in being with the therapist. No, the therapist is empowering you to have the skills to take away even after therapy has been terminated. You can still use those skills.
Recently, there was a TED Talk, Dr. R. Williams, I don't know if you've seen it, and he makes this argument, breaks it down, that racism can actually make you sick. But from a mental health standpoint, does it have that same impact?
It absolutely does have that impact. There is that psychological impact that has a lot to do with people's ability to form trusting relationships, people's ability to have hope for the future, people's ability to be motivated toward whatever goals they may have had, the ability to believe that the special and unique giftings that they have will actually come to the surface and be celebrated by the community which doesn't happen when someone's life is snuffed out early. And so there are all of these threats, both perceived and real threats, that people have been going through as a result of seeing these images, experiencing these kinds of injustices, whether via protest or in actual engagement with law enforcement officials, that creates all kinds of psychological sickness.
I cannot wait to hear what historical moment you selected and why it's significant to you and why you think it should be significant to other people.
All right. I am going to introduce for my historical moment the work of Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, the first female to graduate from Columbia University with a doctorate in psychology, and the second Black to graduate from Columbia with that doctorate after her husband, Kenneth Clark. And Kenneth and Mamie worked together to conduct many of the doll studies, contributed to Brown versus Board of Education's 1954 decision. In the dolls test, she was looking at Black children and how they responded to the presentation of a Black doll and a white doll. And so they were asked questions such as, which doll is a nice doll? Which one do you want to play with? Which one looks bad? And so she could tell by the responses of these children who were as young as age 3 and went through age 7. She found out that they were often showing the racial bias that was a part of our culture.
As we're looking at social justice issues, education disparities are a huge part of that. And then the work that she did, how does that still play out today?
Why that is important today is, number one, we're seeing that issues around segregation, desegregation, integration are still very much live in the processes of our children's and grandchildren's educations. And so it's relevant, I think, especially for COVID, because people are finding out just how there have been many imbalances in access to educational tools and platforms. And so I will applaud our local school systems to the degree that they've said, all right, now that all of the students are virtual, we're going to make sure that everybody has access to a Chromebook, to a mobile hotspot. Okay, so that has helped to level the field somewhat. It doesn't take care of all of the other inequities and social determinants that we know are in operation, but it does help to level the field a bit. And so what we're going to see within COVID-19, I believe, is that even with that apparent leveling, that there's still going to be some opportunities for some kids to surge forward with their educations, depending on whether their school systems are allowing them face-to-face education with teachers who are doing synchronous live types of teaching versus other students who might be more exposed to videos. Teachers who may give more work versus less work, have more creative ways of using technology versus not really knowing themselves how to leverage technology for this moment. So we're going to start to see some differences there. Some students who have more supports are going to be able to surge forward in their educations. Others may actually lag behind. And so in that way, Clark's work helps us to think about, what are some differences that are still occurring in education?
Things that all parents, white, Black, brown, Asian, Latinx, whatever, need to be mindful of: self-esteem, healthy self-esteem for their children.
In 2010, Dr. Margaret Beal Spencer replicated the studies and was actually featured on CNN in a discussion of her findings. And what we found was that really 70 years later, we were seeing some of the very same patterns, which tells us that we've probably made less progress educationally and psychologically than we would like to think. And so Dr. Spencer's work was showing us the impact of white bias, how both white children and Black children were showing the white bias, and Black children perhaps a little less so, but that both groups were showing the white bias, which reveals to us this sort of myth of white superiority that still exists in our culture, and how it is tied into the self-esteem of Black children. And so that is very relevant because we're still thinking not only about diagnoses of anxiety, depression, autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Those are sort of the in-your-face diagnoses that many parents are contending with. But what we don't always pay as much attention to is what is the impact of having a low self-esteem on your future writ large? How is it that you're able to achieve your goals, regardless of the arena or the industry to which you feel you've been called? How is it that you can grow up and be a person who is a productive citizen, as we often say, for your community? How can you be an effective parent? How is it that you are perhaps an employee or even an entrepreneur who creates opportunity for your community if you don't feel good about yourself, right?
Absolutely.
So those children were seeing themselves in a negative light, and then without appropriate intervention, just grow up with the same attitudes and behaviors, shows us that we still have a long way to go. Yes.
Now let's talk about action steps.
So I want to focus my action steps specifically around some issues of colorism. And I have to say, as a psychologist in 2020, it still amazes me the degree to which people are hurting, grown men crying in my office, talking about the hurt that they've been subjected to as a result of their skin color. So I want to be really specific about talking about action steps in that area. So one of those areas is resisting some of the stereotypes that we sometimes carry forward, even within our families. You know, sometimes we're sitting around and joking and talking about somebody's big lips or good hair, or talking about, you black, you better stay back, or whatever those outdated things are that we still carry forward generationally. And so I've written about this in my book, actually, that one of the most important things that women and mothers in particular can do is to push back on those messages. Sometimes that actually involves active confrontation. At other times it involves re-educating people, giving corrective measures, telling children that, you know, what your uncle said is absolutely not true about you, for example. Okay. And so that's a really important thing, to resist the narratives. Another thing that's really important is to validate, right? So we have all of these negative comments that may occur, and I think the audience can appreciate that depending on your family or your cultural group, that sort of the definition shifts. And so you might be the darkest person in your classroom, but the lightest person in your family. Right? And so your identity tends to shift based on your location, your social location. And so we have to validate each other in ways where we have been invalidated in the past, right? And then another action step I want to think about for each family is to, and I'm starting with the family because that's the primary point of education. The family has to present for our kids who, for example, may be in a public school or a private school, or honestly, even homeschooled, where you're subjected to information coming in that tells you different truths about who you are. And so it is imperative for Black parents and parents of color to be able to present for their children. Here are wonderful examples of excellence right here in our own cultural group, okay? And those don't happen to just constitute this upper echelon of skin color or socioeconomic class. They are all over the place. So let's be intentional about talking about all of the talent that exists across our race, across color, so that when we get those images that negate who we are, we've already built up a counter narrative that is stronger.
That's why, I call the GRIOT power in narratives, because storytelling, images, a consistent story gets implanted in your mind, consciously or subconsciously, right? Yes. And we have to pay attention to the way in which a story is told, how we're constructing that story, whom we're sharing the story with, and then also how we're interpreting the story individually and collectively. And you have given us some real tangible tips that we can apply today. Parents that are getting ready to sit at their dinner tables with their kids, help them with their homework because they're working virtually. They can also include a little module about self-esteem,
Absolutely.
include a conversation to discuss an issue in popular culture right now. Maybe we do need to deconstruct Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion's walk video. Let's talk about what that means for you as a young girl going into middle school. Blossoming Hope is the book that you wrote. I was deeply impacted by this book. What made you write this book, and what can we kind of quickly take away from it?
The book was conceived out of the direct professional work that I do every day, serving clients. I do see quite a few children and teens, but I have some adults on my caseload as well. But when I'm thinking about the bigger picture of effectiveness and impact on our community, I had to go upstream. And that's why I wrote the book. And then as you listed, I do have some musical talents as well that I wanted to bring to bear, because there are some messages that are better perceived through the medium of music or through a spoken word recording than through reading a book.
Yeah, it's a fascinating read. I recommend it to anyone, and not just women, men. If you want to take a look at the woman in your life and how she may be mitigating some circumstances. If you live long enough, you will have baggage. You live long enough, you will have some experiences that bring you to crossroad moments. So the book is brilliant. It's beautifully written. I think that you are truly, truly one of the most authentic thought leaders in your area of expertise. And I am so grateful that you took the time to chat with us. We're going to make sure we share your website at the end of the program for anyone who might be looking for hope. They might need to come to your center. And again, no shame in seeking help, no shame in taking time to take care of yourself, especially in the midst of a pandemic, two pandemics, COVID-19, as well as social injustices. So Dr. Tonya Armstrong, thank you for being here, GRIOT.
You are most welcome. Thank you for having me.